Hello, everyone, and welcome to Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. Today, we're joined by Dr. Lawrence Mykytiuk, Professor Emeritus at Purdue University. Today, we're going to talk about some archaeologically confirmed biblical figures. Dr. Lawrence, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So our first question, as always, how do you take your coffee or any other caffeinated beverage?
Yeah, I try to avoid coffee breaths, so I go for tea just with milk or cream. And if I am drinking a caffeinated soft drink, I shake it to make it go flat. Yeah,
Interesting. Why do you like flat soda?
I don't want air in my stomach.
Give us your story. What's your biography, so to speak?
Okay, I was raised in a mainline denomination, and I sort of came under an awareness of sin by the by the liturgy. Our congregation every Sunday would confess that we're sinful, et cetera, et cetera. That began to ring true with me individually. So I thought, I need to get out of this problem. I actually left a bad home situation and joined the Navy. On board ship, I attended a Bible study. We went through the Gospel of John chapter by chapter, and I saw those wonderful promises, he who believes in me has not future will have, but has eternal life. And I thought, wow, this is terrific. I hope this stuff is true. I had I wanted to find out, could I trust this? And then we pulled into a port where there was this is in the Mediterranean. We pulled into a port where there was a Christian Servicemen Center. There I heard an exposition of Psalm 22. If you look at Psalm 22, about the first, 16, 20 verses or so, it's a graphic picture of the crucifixion, starting out with the words of Jesus, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? At the top, it says a Psalm of David. That means it was either written by him or it was in his possession or whatever. But in any case, it was written centuries before the crucifixion. And it gives really the details, all the details you would expect of someone who is being crucified. Intense thirst, bones out of joint. It says, they pierced my hands and my feet. And I have been through that. And it can also mean in Hebrew, it can also, if you modify the text very slightly, the vocalization, it can be as a lion, my hands and my feet. That's an alternative, and people who don't want it to be about Jesus love that one. But guess what? What would a lion do to your hands and your feet? So, yeah, it works. And once I understood that, it talks about day and night. I cry to you, etc. And when Jesus was on the cross, he was crucified about 9 a.m. and at 12 noon, it turned dark. So day and night. You can't manage that with eyewitnesses. You can't sell that if people haven't seen it. So I trusted in the promises in the Gospel of John, became a believer. Before that, I was a good church-going guy. I knew how to be a good denominational member, but I didn't have a personal relationship with Jesus. So that's how I got into that personal relationship. Eventually, I ended up in grad school going for an MA and then a doctorate in Hebrew and Semitic studies, and I ran across an article that had a picture of a seal impression in clay, said belonging to Yehoshua, somebody's name, the son of Mykytiuk, and then it said Eved, which means royal servant. That word is always followed in a seal impression from somebody's signet ring in clay. That word is always followed by either the name of a king or the words the king or else the name of a deity. So after Eved, it says Chizkiyahu, which means Hezekiah. And I was dumbstruck. I just looked at that. I didn't know that anything such existed like that. But this was implying very clearly that Hezekiah was the king whom this servant served. I got all excited, and that became my dissertation topic, to find other inscriptions that refer to people in the Bible. The dissertation was, how do you know it's the person in the Bible that they're referring to? And that was 327 pages of how do you know? Because some of the inscriptions I covered ended up having problems, I ended up writing a long article, 84-page article on corrections and updates, because some of those inscriptions were from the antiquities market and they were not trustworthy. They could have been forged, not a lot of them, but enough to be a problem. And so I decided nobody's going to read a 300-page dissertation and an 80-page article just to get a few identifications, okay? So I wrote an article which was surprisingly short, that included all the good results I got out of those two publications. It ended up with 16 people. And I thought, now I'm done with it. I've clarified it for everybody. That was in 2012. In 2013, January, I got a phone call from a man named Herschel Shanks. He was the founding editor of Biblical Archaeology Review. I was amazed that he phoned me, and I knew who he was. And he said he thought he saw an article in my article where I summarized the good results. And that article turned out to be 5 articles, 2 on the Old Testament, 1 on Jesus, and 2 on other people in the New Testament, from 2014 to 2021. So once that came out, I had more to do. I had to follow up by writing a book, which I'm now writing, on how do I know that those people are the people in the Bible. I now have it. I published 53, but I've added 2 more. So now there are 55 people in the Old Testament, and in the New Testament there are 30. So that's 85 people and counting. So I'm excited about it. I'm still on fire about it.
That bar article is actually why we're talking today. I found that, and I'll be very interested in reading your book and seeing all those listed out. I think it's a great historical resource. Who are the most verified people in the Bible, archaeologically and or historically? That we just have a lot of evidence for. These might not be famous people, but just people that we have a lot of verified evidence. Give us, 1 to 3 and some examples of how they were verified.
I'm not sure I have 3. I can tell you Hezekiah is all over the place. There were at least 7 or 8, maybe more, clay impressions on the antiquities market, which could have been forged. And a later discovery ended up verifying all of them, or just about all of them, because of the way it was portrayed. It had a picture of the sun with wings, and then it says, and it had his name on it. Eventually, they found Eilat Mazar, an Israeli archaeologist who's now passed away, but she did great things. She excavated in Jerusalem at the north uphill end of the city of David, just off the platform where the Mosque of Omar is now, the golden dome that everybody sees. Just south of that, they found, excavating there, she found a garbage heap. And one of the items in the garbage was a botched clay seal impression from the seal ring of the king. Okay. And yes, it says belonging, and it has 1 or 2 spots where the clay might have had a stone in it, and it was I don't know if someone was swatting a mosquito when they pressed it into the clay, but if you look at it on your left side, as you look at it, a couple of letters are cut off, and yet you still have the ring that goes around the writing there, so they bent their wrist or something when they did it, so it was botched, and that's why it was in the garbage. It says belonging to Chizkiyahu ben Achaz, although the H in Achaz is squished off, and it's continued in the next line with the letter equivalent to Z, and then it says At first, they interpreted it the son of Melchiyahu, but eventually they realized that between the MLK for Melech and YH, they saw a dot which separates two words. So it was Melech Yehudah, King of Judah. Okay, that is a royal seal impression that somebody threw out because it was not good enough for royal use. The other seal impressions that were in clay that were on the antiquities market they're probably they look like they're all verified to me. They have the same iconography and everything, the same pictures. So that's the big one. I was trying to think of anybody else who has abundant evidence. When you get into really ancient things from 3,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago, it's a little hard to come up with lots of evidence. So I'm gonna skip out on that one unless I think of somebody else. But that's the big one for me.
Perfectly reasonable. You've already mentioned so far about these are probably not forgeries. This is probably not a forgery. That's probably not a forgery. What's a good and safe way to interpret inscriptions, especially to make sure they're not a forgery on the antiquities market?
Yeah. Let me start with the most straightforward way. I'm going to leave the antiquities market alone for a while. What you want is something that has been excavated, dug up by archaeologists in a controlled excavation, and they've recorded exactly where they found it, and they've cleaned it off, and they know exactly what it says. So it should be what they call provenance. Provenance is comes from fourth, and the venue or venire in Latin, to come from or to come. So where does it come from? And if you know where it came from, i.e., an excavation, some things were carved impossibly high on a mountainside and a sheer cliff, and nobody's going to go all the way up and risk their lives just to forge an inscription. So, so if you have something that's provenanced, then you've avoided the possibility of forgery. When it comes to interpretation, that's a tricky one. A lot of past publications interpret inscriptions according to biblical content. That was true up through the early 1990s. But the problem is, if you interpret something according to a known text, and then you try to use that interpretation of the inscription to verify the known text, that's circular logic. You've polluted the content of the inscription by interpreting it according to the Bible. Not that the Bible is bad, but that in interpretation you want something that's cold separate from the Bible in order to validate what you read in the Bible. Okay, it's independent attestation. In other words, this person is mentioned in the Bible, but also mentioned separately in an inscription. So interpretation has to be by provenance, that is, dug up, excavated inscriptions, and so you do your interpretation, and then in the last step, after interpreting it and interpreting the Bible passage that mentions that person, then you compare them. And when you compare them, you're looking for authentic data. In other words, the inscription is not forged, not faked. Sometimes people take something ancient, like a scroll, and then they write something on it in modern times, trying to make it look ancient. And that's called a fake. That's a technical term. It's a fake. A forgery, you start from scratch and make the whole thing by yourself. Okay, so what you want is unpolluted data. You want authentic data in the inscription, and you need to make sure that the Bible passage doesn't have flaws in it, i.e., bad text or a translation that gives a different name or something like that. So far, I have found no problems with authenticity in any of the Bible passages that mention these people. I look at the Hebrew, I look at the Greek, and I look at the Syriac. Syriac is a language that developed from Aramaic, which Jesus spoke. So Syriac came a bit later, but after I compare the versions and the Hebrew, then then that's authentic. So that's the first thing, authentic data. Second of three, the settings, the time and place. Like in literature, people who do British literature, it could be 19th century Britain, okay, or London, okay? So it's time and place. And so you need the right part of a century and you need the right kingdom, okay? So if it's an inscription in Aramaic, you want to look at the Aramean kingdoms around and figure out which one it's from. And the the average active lifespan in biblical times was actually quite surprisingly often was about 50 years. If the inscription refers to somebody within 50 years of when the Bible places them, and they're both in the same kingdom, that's time and place. So you have authentic data, time and place, and then after that, you look at the marks of an individual. The easiest ones are the kings, because usually there was only one king at a time for a given kingdom, although you find David fighting with the descendants of Saul and all that. Or else a high priest, because there was only one high priest at a time in Judah. They're easy because there's only one of them. So if you have the right time and you can date things by the writing, sometimes paleographically they call it old writing, because the writing changed over the centuries. You can place it. It's pretty approximate, but you can place it in a given century. If you have a king like Ahab who fought in a battle in 853 BC or BCE, then and it talks about how many chariots he had and all that. It's written by the enemy, so the enemy isn't out to validate anything to say anything good about Ahab. But we have that from his enemy Shalmaneser III, who fought with Ahab and other kings in a specific battle there. It can only be Ahab because it says Ahab the Israelite. Okay, and when you're fighting kings, you only name the king. You don't mention his generals or like that. Authentic data, settings, and the marks of an individual. Some of the individuals were not kings; they were officials. When you don't have a king or a high priest, where there's only one of them at a time, then you need three pieces of information about them to distinguish them as an individual, such as name, father's name. Those were usually the two items you get, but you need one other piece of information about them. In biblical times, the name and the father's name is enough because you could ask around. You had the society was still there. You could say, "Is this Fred, the son of Joe? Is that the Fred from this town?" Yeah, okay. So then you know it's the same person. But we don't have that anymore. So I require my criteria. I require one more piece of information. It could be where they worked. Was it in the city of David, working for the king? Was it in a given town that is mentioned both in the Bible and is apparent from where they dug it up, or it's mentioned in the inscription? No. Okay. So these are criteria. Interpret according to other inscriptions until the last step. The authentic data, same settings, same century and kingdom, or part of a century. Same, and it has to be the same marks of the individual too, both in the Bible and the inscription. The thing about this is they are criteria. I have 85 people so far confirmed in inscriptions, 55 in the Old Testament, 30 in the New. Most lists you find online or even published and even by scholars, a lot of them have no criteria at all. I repeat, have no criteria. They don't tell you why they think this inscription or how could it possibly refer to a person in the Bible. Usually they just go by the name. Okay? Suppose that from the time of the American Revolution, you have a letter, let's say the bottom half of the end of a letter that says, "Love George." Now, can you conclude that that is George Washington? We don't know, It could be, but there's no way to show that it is. And it's the same with the inscriptions that give the person's name has no other information. Even if it's the same name and father's name, there could have been two people with the same name whose fathers had the same name. So that is on the fence. It's tempting, but it's not a firm identification. I call that a category 2 because there are two pieces of information and you want three. So that's how you interpret an inscription safely and how you make sure that it's the biblical person that the inscription is referring to. Sorry for the long answer.
That was a great in-depth answer. We will pause for a sponsor break from Handy Mike and Genesis Contracting. Handy Mike and Genesis are a locally owned and family-operated handyman and contractor company serving the greater Charlottesville area since 2016. They are a Class A licensed, bonded, and insured contractor with over 60 years of knowledge. Their teams of skilled, reliable, and trustworthy technicians have been handpicked in order to provide our customers with outstanding service across a broad range of tradesman skills. Handy Mike can do all of your home maintenance repairs and small projects, from changing a light bulb to deck repairs to electrical and plumbing fixtures, and so much more. Genesis Contracting can handle larger jobs, including bathroom and kitchen renovations, remodels, and additions. If you're looking for a team to help make your dreams a reality and bring your concept to creation, call them today for a free estimate. 434-422-6000. You can also find more of their information in the show notes. Now, back to the show. Why don't you give us some people from the Bible who were highly questioned by historians, but now have been verified by 1, 2, or even 3 of your criteria?
Yeah, as you mentioned, you were aware, King David, was the object of remarks like, "Oh yeah, he's about as real as King Arthur." And I'm not going to get into the King Arthur issue, but they're saying he was mythical. He was like a legendary hero who wasn't real. Okay, and this was said by a small group of scholars known as the biblical minimalists, starting in the 1960s in Scandinavia and then onward into the 1990s, where as late as 1992, actually a good scholar who's named Philip Davies, P.R. Davies, from the University of Sheffield, he expressed doubt that anything beyond a few smidgens here and there was historical in the whole Old Testament. Okay, the Old Testament in the original languages, the Old Testament is 76 point something of the whole Bible, and the New Testament is 23% point something of the whole Bible. So what he was saying is 3/4 of the Bible is not history. There are spots where you have to make a mistake and put in something historical. That was Davies' attitude, and there were other scholars. Thomas L. Thompson. This is not Tommy Thompson, the governor of Wisconsin. Once upon a time, this is Thomas L. Thompson, and he wrote a long book that Davies built on to make this claim. There were a couple of others from Scandinavia. So those people I found irritating because just because someone was mentioned in a collection of religious writings that we have today, they categorize them as unhistorical. Just because those writings happen to be collected into the Bible. That strikes me as an extremely prejudiced approach, and being irritated, when you're a bit angry, you get a lot of energy. So I had quite a bit of energy going into this. Eventually, I'm willing to let the minimalist just be minimalist, and I'm excited about the verifications or the confirmations that I found, and I'm not irritated at them anymore. It got me going though. Yeah.
Yeah, I can somewhat understand figures like Samson that the biblical minimalists would probably be like, well, we'll never know. He's some folk hero that was written in. I can kind of put on that cap, and even in my own Christian faith,
Yeah.
like I can understand where they're coming from.
Sure.
But
Yes.
there's lots of other evidence throughout other cultures that are primarily oral that we can somewhat trace kernels or even larger pieces of truth of history. So those type of people, I understand but I think they probably throw too much dust in the wind.
Yeah, I think for me, their main value was they got me motivated. And so these four scholars, there were four big ones at the beginning, uh, they uh, they motivated hundreds of other scholars to do the homework. Okay, and I was one of them. So
And we thank you for that. Who are some biblical figures that have not been archaeologically verified, but either at least you or maybe some other historians in your camp still believe
and
existed, albeit in some form?
I would say Solomon, the son of David, in a book chapter by Baruch Halpern, Halpern, Halpern. He has a wonderful chapter in the book titled "The Old Testament in Archaeology and History," and he brings out all kinds of evidences for a united monarchy, which is disputed in biblical studies, and he shows how they many evidences point to a united monarchy. There's a city called at Tel Qeyyafa, which seems to correspond to the biblical Sha'arayim. Sha'arayim is a dual; it means two gates. This city is it might be the only one, but it's certainly a rare one that has two city gates. And it's just downhill from Jerusalem, overlooking the valley of Elah, where, according to the books of Samuel, David fought Goliath. Okay, so not far from Jerusalem, and it seemed to have had a religious function. It didn't last very long. It was from the 10th century, which is United Monarchy time, and it didn't last. It lasted probably about maybe slightly less than a century, and then it was abandoned or destroyed or whatever. But so you have these evidences of a united monarchy that are Baruch Halpern just goes through lots and lots of them, and he shows that without a monarchy, you don't get these huge stones put into a wall as a defensive fortification. You need a big kingdom to do that kind of thing. And he makes that argument. If I can go back a little to the three people who were verified unexpectedly, King David was found to be mentioned and I believe confirmed in the House of David inscription from Tel Dan at the extreme northern tip of Israel, where these days Syria, but in those days it was called Aram. And it says House of David. In the line just above that, in this House of David inscription, which is a victory stele written by an enemy, the enemies verified a lot of these people. It refers to the king of Israel, Melech Yisrael. And then on the next line, it as a parallel, actually, it says the last letter of the word king, but it has other interpretations. But it could be the last letter of king, the word king, Melech, of the House of David. So the House of David was a dynasty, and in those days, in parallel inscriptions from nearby kingdoms, House of with the name means that there was a dynasty, and then the person whose house it was the founder of a dynasty, a line of kings. Guess what? David was the founder of a line of kings in the southern kingdom. So it fits. And I think it's a strong case there. Also, before there were any inscriptions known to correspond to the Bible, a British adventurer named Austen, Austen, Layard, Layard, went to the Middle East and did excavations. He spent about 18-month periods in Mesopotamia digging. And as a result, there were about 10 kings who were verified in the inscriptions that he dug up. Now, the Europeans had to learn how to read cuneiform. They had to know that this was genuine and so on. He dug them up, so they were genuine. But there were 10 kings, and so I have a book that says, written by a uh, a Presbyterian scholar from a previous generation, Robert Dick Wilson, a scientific investigation of the Old Testament, and he goes through these kings. Now, it was a bombshell when it became known that one of those kings was also mentioned in the Bible that had never occurred before. And the Victorians were frankly a little worried about scriptural verification because a lot of science was growing and there was lots of critical approaches to scripture which did not necessarily get into historicity. In 1851, it was discovered that on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser, who was an Assyrian conqueror, it mentions Jehu, king of Israel. You know, Jehu. Now he was one of the bad guys. He kind of joined with an enemy to become king, and then he wiped out the current king, assassinated somebody, and then presto, he was king. So. He would have been viewed as a traitor by many Israelites, but guess what? He was the king of Israel. And in 1851, that became known, and then others followed. So they ended up with 10 of them. So between King David and Jehu, those are two that were unexpected, put it that way.
Do you have a specific archaeological find that you find most interesting? I guess asked in another way, do you have a favorite finds or inscriptions?
Yes, these have not been published. Okay, I mentioned them in a biblical archaeology review on the website. I mentioned them as first. I said these look tempting, but I can't buy it. Later on, I said stay tuned. I'll publish them. Okay, there are three people mentioned in tombs or bone boxes around Jerusalem that they've discovered. This is not forged. These are things that had been dug up. Three people who were the founders of priestly lines. Okay, if you look in First Chronicles 24, there it's said that David appointed priestly lines to take turns doing the duties of priests. Okay, and there are 24 of them. Guess what? First Chronicles 24. Of them, three names found in burial inscriptions correspond to three of those of the 24 mentioned in First Chronicles 24. The first one is named Khazir, okay, and the inscription over his family gravesite, it's kind of a cave, and all these boxes of bones are in there. And it says it gives a genealogy, okay, the name, son of, name, and the earliest one is, guess what, Khazir, who's named in First Chronicles 24. He was the founder of the priestly line. That just blows my mind. Now, I might not buy that, except there are two more. One is Yakim, who's also named in a burial inscription, and in First Chronicles 24, and also Maaziah or Maaziyahu, who's named in a burial inscription and in First Chronicles 24. Those three I discovered by getting a copy of the book. It's CIIP, Corpus of Inscriptions, Judean Palestinian, okay, from Judea or Palestine, okay, and this is very ambitious work. They're try to publish every single inscription that has been found in what we call the Holy Land, and doing it by regions. And they started with Jerusalem, and that's where these burial inscriptions were found. And when I compared that with First Chronicles 24, 3 out of 24 after 2,500 years is pretty good. Actually, time of David would be 3,000 years. So those are favorites, and I've still got to publish them.
Well, we look forward to keeping up with your research. What are
Thank you.
some myths you commonly hear about about the authenticity of biblical figures, and how do you dispel such notions?
Well, the big one is Jesus of Nazareth. Um, some people say he was not a real person. Other people like to sound pretty intellectual, and they say he probably was a real person, as if they had looked at all the evidence. If you look at the evidence, it is, let's say, very strong. The Roman historian Tacitus, we have the word tacit, which means unspoken. And in music, you have tacet, which means be quiet for this measure. Interestingly, Tacitus made great use of silence in what he wrote. He was a historian. He was probably among the best, if not the best, Roman historian. And at the height of his career, near the end of his life, he wrote biographies of the Roman emperors. And he mentioned that in the chapter on his chapter on Nero, he said that there was a fire in Rome, and this is in the AD 60s, and it's spread throughout parts of Rome. And what do you know? Just in the very neighborhood and place where Nero wanted to have a building project, that was after a few days of fire, that started on fire too. And everyone was suspicious that Nero had ordered it to be burned. Okay. And so Nero, and Tacitus tells all this stuff. He said that Nero, to cast the blame on somebody else, blamed the Christians because everybody knew that they had vile customs. They drank human blood and they ate human flesh in their ceremonies, the body and blood. It was totally misunderstood by the pagan Romans, okay? But Tacitus goes on to say they were called Christians or Christians. It's our word for Christian, except it has an E instead of the first I. So, and that was a common name, Christus. It was usually given to slaves and was held by some people who had been slaves and were freemen. It means useful, good, helpful. And he says the founder of the name was named Christus, just the way we spelled the word Christ with US at the end in good Latin. Okay. So he corrects the crowd, the vulgus in Latin, who had the wrong name, but they were close. And he says, no, it was Christus, was the founder of that name. He was put to death. He met the ultimate penalty under the emperorship of Tiberius and the governorship of Pontius Pilate. Holy smokes. In Judea. And he says that vile superstition has spread from Judea into the city, by which he meant Rome, where everything that's horrible and shocking is welcomed and becomes popular. So he was social criticism going on there. But he said this, but he told us that this Christus was punished, met the ultimate penalty. I don't think he uses the word crucified, but that's implicit. Some people who study Latin say that that's implicit. And then it was in Judea, and then that his followers had spread. And he still had followers even after being crucified, and some had come to Rome. So the two big sources on Jesus are Tacitus and a Jewish historian named Josephus. It's the name Joseph plus us at the end. And he chose the name of the emperor's family, Flavius. They were Flavians who were emperors, who favored him and gave him a place to live and put the resources of the empire at his disposal to write his histories. He wrote two big ones, was the Jewish War, and the other was Jewish Antiquities. In the Jewish Antiquities, he mentions Jesus in two places. One is in book, which for Josephus was a chapter. One is in book 18, and then later on in book 20. The simpler of the two is in book 20, where he's talking about James, who was ordered to be killed by the high priest who was opposed to the Christian movement. And James was the brother of Jesus, was a leader in that and had been for decades leader of the Christians in Jerusalem, where the church started. And so when in the sort of downtime between one governor and the next Roman governor, before the next governor showed up, this high priest, Ananus, son of Ananus, ordered that James be killed. And he wanted to identify exactly who this James was. So he says, James, the brother of Jesus. But there are lots of people named James. Actually, the Jewish word is Jacob, and it became James in English. Strange story, but that's it. So it's Jacob, the son, whose brother was Jesus. But there were lots of Jesuses. If you look in his writings, there are at least a dozen people named Jesus. Not all of them were very nice people. So in order to say which Jesus, he says, Jesus who is called Messiah. Holy smokes. Now, if Jesus were not real and Josephus were trying to tell which James he meant, it would make no sense for him to mention Jesus who was called Messiah. That's in book 20. In book 18, there's a longer description of Jesus, but it's been, let's say, edited by somebody who wanted Josephus to call Jesus the Messiah. Okay, so all the Greek versions have included in that long paragraph describing Jesus in book 18. It says the statement is Jesus, talking about Jesus, he was the Messiah. Josephus wrote his Antiquities of the Jews, or Jewish Antiquities, to Romans to extol Judaism. He wasn't trying to evangelize. He was not a believer in Jesus, but he was neutral enough to say, he was called Messiah. Okay. Now, if you look at translations from the Greek, the Greek manuscripts all give us that. But if you look at the translations of them, which are a couple of them are very early, three of them into different languages say, instead of he was the Messiah, it says he was called the Messiah. He was believed to be the Messiah. He was said to be the Messiah. So in those three early translations, Arabic, Syriac, you have the original, which does sound like Josephus's own position, okay, instead of extolling him as the Messiah. You have Josephus and you have Tacitus, and those are enough to put it over the top. And the way you dispel the myths about Jesus is simply to bring forth the evidence. And I have that article in Biblical Archaeology Review, which is really long. It has long footnotes, but they published it, and the evidence is there.
We will link that below in the show notes.
Okay, yeah. You don't have to subscribe to a Biblical Archaeology Review. You just go to the Biblical Archaeology Society website, and it's there open, and it's open for free access. Yeah.
What are some myths in the field of archaeology that you hear? How would you correct such claims? Of course, outside anything Indiana Jones related.
Yeah. But if you have the right hat, you're in business. So a lot of people who want to dig think that it's pretty exciting. You're always going to find something ancient and interesting and maybe even pivotal for biblical studies. Wrong impression. There's a hill called a mound or a tell that used to be a city, and as the garbage piled up on top of the hill where the city was, it grew vertically into a nice big hill. And you see what look like steps dug into the side of these hills called a tell. The people who lead the archaeological digs are looking at this hill, and there are, let's say, if not tons, at least thousands of pounds of dirt that need to be moved. And they have these volunteers from the United States or from other countries or people from Israel who want to be in on the dig. And guess what? You're going to sweat a lot. Okay. You might not find anything. It's a lot of work moving hundreds and hundreds of pounds of dirt. So they start early in the morning. They arrive at the tell before the sun rises, and they dig until the sun gets unbearable, and then they quit around noon, and they're done for the day. So it's not always a nice experience. One of the professors that I know who had been on digs talked about scorpions that you find on tells. Okay, and not everything is pleasant. So that's the myths about the field of archaeology. What you want is a dig where the dig leader or some of the people involved in the leadership actually teach you about that tell, about its history, about how to dig, and give you enough background so you're really motivated knowledgeably instead of just being a workhorse.
Well, we already know that you're coming out with a book, and we will. Is there a blog that you have, or you connect with us?
It's those articles in Biblical Archaeology Review that are really sort of the best shot. There's another book I have. It's published by a campus Christian organization called Ratio. It's spelled like the word ratio, ratio of 5 to 3, like that. Ratio Christi. It's the word Christ plus I at the end. That means the reason of Christ. And it's about a 30-page booklet. And in it, I have listed the results of about 30 years of research, okay, both Old Testament and New Testament. And you can get it online if you just go to Radio Christi Press, you'll find it. It's something like, I think it's $3 or $5, like that. And it's the most thorough thing that I published. It doesn't give the rationale for every single identification. That would be another dissertation. But it covers the ground. Both Old Testament and New Testament, and also the officials that they've confirmed by inscriptions.
Thank you so much for coming on Church Coffee. We'll see you guys next week. Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.